She didn't cry, she didn't beg. She simply whispered, her voice trembling, her heart aching, her eyes still full of love. "I love you." And in that instant, as if that phrase had triggered a hidden trigger in the chest of the man who swore control over everything, he simply stood, avoided her gaze, and with an almost theatrical coldness said, "Get your things. Now." There was no argument. There was no explanation. Only the piercing silence of a definitive rejection, as if her presence had suddenly become an unforgivable mistake. But what no one knew, neither he nor she, was that that moment carried an invisible seed, an emotional debt that could not be repaid with money, and that fate, sooner or later, would come to collect, with interest, with precision, and with a twist that would leave him kneeling where she had once been forgotten. Because everything that begins with love and ends in silence doesn't truly end. It remains suspended, trapped in time, like an echo waiting to be heard. She left that night with nothing more than a suitcase and a shattered heart. He remained in the luxurious penthouse, surrounded by marble, art, and absences. But the universe doesn't forget. When life is touched by true feelings, karma doesn't care about status, bank accounts, or last names printed in newspapers. And just when the millionaire thought he had finally forgotten that whisper, he began to hear his own conscience in the form of coincidences. A letter, a child, a name in the hospital. And everything began to crumble like the columns of the mansion where he believed he controlled destiny. What he had done to her, the world was now doing to him, only slowly, and in front of everyone. If this story touched you, like the video and subscribe. What comes next will move you. When she first arrived at that house, the sun was still setting behind the cool California hills. The mansion was silent, imposing, almost indifferent to the presence of someone like her. With her. Hair tied simply and a small suitcase in her hands, she walked as if she already knew she didn't belong there, but needed to pretend she did. She was just one of many others who had passed through, but there was something in her gaze that didn't match the usual submissiveness of those who serve. There was dignity, not pride, but a kind of silent resistance, and that was precisely what bothered the man watching from the upstairs balcony. He didn't speak to her that first day. He limited himself to instructing the housekeeper on her duties, then disappeared back to his office, where the windows were always closed, even with the blue sky outside. Rumor had it he'd lost his wife 3 years earlier. Not in an accident, not from illness. She'd simply left, and left only a letter. Since then, the millionaire who once graced magazine covers as a visionary and ruthless man had become a sleek shadow of his former self. He worked too much, talked too little, and wouldn't allow anyone to cross the threshold of the upper floor, until she did, but not intentionally. It was her third day at work, and she'd been told to leave a tray of coffee at the office door. But that day, the door was ajar, and he was inside, sitting on the floor, his eyes red, a half-empty bottle beside him. When he saw her, instead of sending her away, he said one thing she'd never forgotten. "Don't say anything. Just close the door." She obeyed, but she didn't forget. From that moment on, an almost invisible tension began to build between them. There were no direct glances, no extra words, but everything about her, the way she arranged the flowers, the way she dusted the antique bookshelf, even the choice of low classical music playing in the hallways, seemed to reach something in him that no million-dollar investment ever could. He noticed, but he pretended not to. Every day she was no longer invisible, and that scared him more than any bankruptcy. He began to notice her without realizing it, in the small details that had previously gone unnoticed. How she held her cup with both hands to avoid spilling the coffee, how she avoided looking the other employees directly in the eyes, how she seemed to prefer the company of silence to any idle conversation. It was as if she had been molded to occupy spaces delicately, without leaving a mark, and yet to be missed when she was gone. He, accustomed to having everything he wanted at the snap of a finger, began to chafe at his own curiosity. Why was someone so ordinary throwing him off balance? At the dinner she hosted for 2 Arab investors, she served the table with such precision that the head waiter quietly commented, She has the hands of someone who has suffered. The millionaire didn't respond, but by then he already knew it. He felt it. And what was worse, he was beginning to identify with that pain she never verbalized. There was a shadow in her eyes that mirrored his own, and the more he tried to ignore it, the more it grew within him. One evening, while walking through the mansion's back garden, a place he himself had designed but rarely visited, he heard the soft sound of a melody. He followed the sound and found her sitting near the glass greenhouse, an old radio in her hands. The song was by a French singer from the 1960s, and she was humming the lyrics softly, unaware she was being watched. There was no makeup on her face. There was no intention of seduction. It was just her, with her own memories, trying to exist in a world that didn't see her. He stood there, watching from afar, and in that moment, for the first time in years, he felt something that confounded his logic, a desire to get closer. But he didn't. In the following days, he began to test the limits of their invisible relationship. He asked unnecessary questions. He called her when he could have easily called another employee. He observed her reactions, searching for flaws, some weakness that would justify the growing discomfort she caused. But she never gave him what he was looking for, always firm, always polite, always one step away. And it was precisely this distance that drove him crazy. One Sunday, during a storm that left half the city without power, she was the only one left in the house. Most of the staff had been dismissed. He came down from the bedroom with a bottle of wine and found her placing candles on the kitchen table. There were no words, just two glances that for the first time didn't stray. He poured her a glass. She refused. He insisted. And when she accepted, it was as if an invisible boundary had been crossed. They didn't talk about the past. They didn't talk about the present. They talked about nothing. And it was the most genuine conversation he'd had in years. For the first time, he didn't need to impress, and she didn't need to protect herself. When the light returned, they both seemed to mourn silently, because they knew that what had happened there, in that interval of darkness, wasn't ordinary. It was real, and everything real frightens those who live by appearances. In the days following that stormy night, something invisible had settled between them. It wasn't romance, not yet, nor was it friendship. It was something denser, more instinctive, as if they had both entered a territory where one treads not with feet but with memories. She, who had always kept her head down, now raised her eyes for a few extra seconds. He, who avoided any form of vulnerability, began searching her out with his eyes before he'd even admitted it to himself, and it was thus in this field of silence and tension that the bond began to form. One Monday morning, he asked her to bring him a specific book from his office, a book that by chance, or perhaps not, was high on the shelf. When she entered, he was on the phone, his back to her, talking in a low voice about a fierce negotiation. She didn't want to hear, but she did, and she realized how ruthless he was in business. It frightened her, but at the same time as she climbed onto the small stool to reach the book, she noticed something on the top shelf, an old photograph, half hidden, of a woman in a blue dress. The frame was facing inward. He could tell she noticed. When he hung up, he simply said, "She was my wife." Nothing more. She nodded silently and left the book on the table, and when she was at the door, he said, without looking at her, "I didn't hate her. I just didn't know how to love." That sentence haunted her for days. And something inside her began to break. She didn't want to feel anything for him. She knew the risk. She knew the social chasm. She knew the stories. But what he said with his body wasn't what he said with his words. The way he held her arm as he passed by, the way he discreetly observed the tie on her apron, the way he left small things in her path, a clean cup, a book open to the page she commented on. They were signs, small, but glaring to someone who has learned to hear what is unsaid. And then came the day of the accident. One of the servants dropped an expensive vase in the main hall. It was a collector's item. When the millionaire found out, he stormed down. And it was she who, without thinking, stepped between him and the young man. She said, "It was an accident. I was nearby. It could have been my fault." He looked at her as if he'd seen something he hadn't expected, something that disarmed him. He ordered everyone to leave. It was just her and him, alone. She expected a scolding. But he simply walked up to her and, in a low voice, almost like a surrender, said, "You don't have to protect me." She replied without hesitation, "But I want to." It was the first time he touched her face, not with desire, but with astonishment, as if confronted by something he thought he didn't deserve. The touch lasted seconds, but it was then that everything changed, because from that moment on, what had previously been avoided became inevitable, and they both knew, even without admitting, that what existed between them no longer fit within the silence that protected them. The next night he didn't sleep. He paced the hallways of the house like a man trying to escape something he carries inside. The image of her touch, her skin beneath his fingers, the phrase spoken with a truth that disarmed all logic. All of it echoed like a note out of step with the life he had so masterfully constructed. She, on the other hand, spent the night awake for the opposite reason. Not fear of what was to come, but the possibility that it had been just an isolated moment, a daydream that dawn would erase. But when the sun rose, he came downstairs earlier than usual and found her making coffee. There was a silence between them, but it wasn't the same silence anymore. It was the kind of silence that begs for continuity. Over the next few days, gestures took precedence over words. She left fresh flowers in his office. He began eating lunch in the kitchen, wherever she was. Little by little, the mansion's previously impassable rooms began to be crossed by glances, presences, and subtle movements. One day he asked her if she liked books. She replied that she read at night to forget the world. The next morning, she found on his bedside table a rare copy of a Russian novel with a handwritten inscription, "Some worlds are worth forgetting, but others we rebuild with those who stay." She didn't answer, but she embraced him with her eyes when she saw him from afar. It was a Friday night. That the kiss happened, natural, unexpected, inevitable. She had gone upstairs with a towel, unaware he was out of the room. Seeing him coming out of the shower, she tried to pull away, but he simply said, "Stay." There was no tension, no urgency. He approached slowly, as if knowing he was treading on sacred ground. And then, without haste, he pressed his lips to hers. The world didn't stop, but they both did. For entire seconds, they stayed there, breathless, without excuse, without turning back. When they pulled away, she said softly, "This shouldn't be happening." And he, for the first time in years, smiled. But it is. That night, he didn't sleep alone. But there was no sex. There was silence again. There were two bodies too close, sharing the same space carefully, with a reverence that desire could never explain. He told her stories from his childhood. She spoke of her father who disappeared when she was little. They laughed at sad memories. They cried over memories they didn't even know hurt. And when morning came, he said, "Don't leave today." She replied, "If I stay, nothing will be the same." And he, looking into her eyes, whispered, "That's exactly what I want." But the problem with wanting the impossible is forgetting that the world out there demands consequences. And that same week, the wife who had disappeared years before reappeared. She arrived as if she had never left, without warning, without ceremony, without regret. The millionaire's ex-wife, the one from the photograph hidden on the shelf, the one whose absence became a legend within the house, was now there, standing in the main entrance, wearing the same blue dress from the photo. Her look wasn't that of someone returning out of love, but of someone returning by right. She simply said, "I'm still legally your wife, and I want everything back." He, who had so often mentally rehearsed what he would say if that day ever came, didn't know how to respond. He stood still, and for the first time in a long time he felt fear. She, the maid, learned of her ex's return from the housekeeper, and she didn't react with anger or shock, only with a silence deeper than all the others. She closed the bedroom door slowly, sat on the edge of the bed, and breathed as if preparing to disappear. She knew. Women like her knew from the start that some stories weren't meant to last, even if they seemed real, even if they hurt more than any lie. That same night she wrote a short note, left it on his desk, and left with the same suitcase she'd arrived with. When he found the paper, he felt the ground give way. The handwriting was firm, but there was a tremor between the lines. It read, "What we experienced was truer than anything I built in this house. But I'm not the kind of woman who shares her feelings, and I don't accept being a shadow." He ran to the door, but she was already gone. He called, searched, and searched through her contacts. Nothing. She had disappeared the same way. She'd arrived silently. His wife, now present in the mansion, watched everything with a mixture of contempt and strategy. She didn't want her husband. She wanted his name, his assets, his control. When she learned by chance of the maid's departure, she said sarcastically, "You always had a taste for broken things. This one seemed just like it." He didn't respond, but something broke inside him in that moment. He realized that by letting this woman go, he wasn't just giving in to the past. He was betraying his own future. Days later, he ordered all contracts with his wife to be terminated. He called lawyers. He took on the legal battle, and no matter how expensive it was, it no longer mattered, because what he wanted now couldn't be bought. He wanted the silence back, the silence that existed when she walked through the house, the light trail of her footsteps, the French music in the garden, the invisible peace that only she knew how to carry. But the world he created wasn't made for lightness. It was made of control, contracts, and figures. And what is light doesn't survive where everything is heavy. He began looking for her on the streets, in shelters, in neighborhood cafes, but it seemed she had vanished from the city, as if fate itself had said, "It's too late now." And it was. Time began to move differently for him after she left. The days no longer felt rushed, and the nights became too long for someone who carried absence like a slow poison. He tried to fill the space. She had left. He changed the furniture, renovated the garden, returned to social events, and began appearing in magazines again with smiling faces beside him. But inside, everything was in turmoil, because you can't replace what you don't understand. And he couldn't explain what he had lost. He only felt it. It was at one of these gala events that reality began to sink in, revealing everything he'd tried to keep quiet. Amid toasts and interviews, one of the firm's partners approached him with a cold stare. "There are rumors of fraud in the investment division." He laughed, as he always did when faced with any threat. But by Monday, newspapers were already running headlines about his firm's involvement in an international tax scandal. And no matter how much he denied it, the truth was that someone had planted the betrayal right next to him, probably while he was too busy trying to fix what had no name. The money began to flow. At first, slowly, then, like an avalanche. Investors disappeared, contracts were broken, stocks plummeted, and the strangest thing, he didn't care, because the only thing he was trying to save, her, was already out of reach. And that was what hurt. It wasn't the financial ruin, it was the human emptiness, the absence of someone who never demanded anything, but gave everything with a simple look. In an almost desperate attempt, he sought out the housekeeper. He asked if she knew where she had gone. The answer was an envelope, small, white, with her name written in soft letters. Inside was only a scrap of cloth, a scarf she used to cover her hair on cold days, and an unsigned note. "What is true needs no place, only courage, and you didn't have it." That completely disarmed him. He sat on the office floor and remained there for hours, just as he had the first time she saw him. His former wife had already left again, this time with part of her fortune, some properties, and a promise never to return. But her absence was a relief. Hers was a raw wound. Time, never merciful, continued its course, and with it came the signs: a perfume he'd smelled by chance, a song playing in elevators, a book with a dedication similar to the one he'd given her, now for sale in a second-hand bookstore on the other side of town. And the strangest thing, a name repeated in a children's hospital, her same name. only accompanied by a word that would change everything. Mother. It was on a cloudy morning that he finally decided to follow the name fate had seemed to whisper for weeks. The hospital was discreet, far from the city centre, dedicated to volunteer care and humanitarian causes. He didn't understand why her name was on that list of active donors, but he couldn't ignore it. When he entered, he was greeted by an assistant who, without recognizing him, asked, "You came to see the boy?" He hesitated. "Which boy?" She replied, "Camille's son." The world stopped. She had a name. She had a son. And she was no longer an absence. She was a mother. He didn't know what to do. He was facing a world that had happened far from him, yet it pierced him more powerfully than any scandal, betrayal, or financial downfall. The assistant, thinking he was a relative, led him to a room where a child was playing with wooden pieces. He had dark brown eyes, the exact same shade that had once strayed from his in the kitchen. But there was more. There was the same silence, the same way of observing before acting. It was like looking into an emotional mirror he never imagined existed. The child smiled shyly. He froze. He didn't know if he should approach, if he had the right. He asked the employee, "Is he?" She added, "He's 4 years old. His mother works here sometimes, but she's on leave now." "Why?" "Health problems. Nothing serious, we hope." But she refused help. She's always been like that, very firm. He wanted to ask more, but couldn't. His throat went dry. The pride that once drove a woman away with a whisper now prevented him from speaking even to a boy. He left the hospital without seeing Camille, unsure if he should persist, but something inside him had already changed. Because it wasn't just guilt now, it was the realization that life went on without him, and it went on beautifully, strong. Even with difficulties, even with absence, she had created a universe of truth from the lie he'd constructed. And the sun carried within him something he'd never had the courage to be: light. In the days that followed, he began visiting the hospital as if spying on a parallel life. He never entered. He just watched from afar. One day he saw her leaving, alone, thin, haggard, but with the same firmness in her walk. She didn't see him, or maybe you did, but chose not to react. And that hurt more than any words. Because he was there, ready to say everything he'd never said. But it was too late. The time he'd wasted in fear, she'd used to build courage. When he finally summoned the strength to look for her, he returned to the hospital with flowers in his hands. He asked for Camille. The nurse looked him in the eye and said, "She asked that if you ever came, we give you this." It was another envelope. Inside, a single handwritten sentence: "You don't have to find me, just find what you lost in yourself." He left the hospital empty-handed and overly full. The city seemed different, or maybe it was just that he no longer saw the same streets with the same eyes. For years, he believed he had control of the people, of the negotiations, of his own feelings. But now, with only a distant child and a woman who refused even to see him again, he felt like just another person in the world, too small to stop fate from returning everything he had caused. And that, although a new pain, was also a liberation. For the first time he had no more excuses. He returned home, or to what had once been home. The mansion was now too silent, almost hollow. The hallways seemed longer, the lights colder. What had once represented power was now just an echo. In the main living room, he sat on the sofa where she used to pass quickly with flowers in her hands. He took out his phone, scrolled through the photo gallery, and realized something devastating. There was not a single image of her, not a single one. He, the man who documented every trip, every work of art, every gala dinner, had no physical memory of the only real thing he had ever had. He began writing letters. He didn't know if she would read them, or if she would receive them. But he wrote anyway, for days, nights, always by hand, without correction, without filter. He told things he'd never told anyone. He confessed mistakes. He begged without begging. One of the letters said, "You saw me when I didn't even see myself, and I sent you away as if that were normal. It wasn't. None of it was." But he didn't send them. He piled the letters on his desk, perhaps waiting for a sign that he deserved to start over. The sign never came. It was then that the doorbell rang, late at night. He wasn't expecting any visitors. He opened the door with his heart racing, but it was just a delivery, an envelope with no return address. Inside, a discreet invitation to a benefit music and poetry performance at a community center in the suburbs, and at the bottom a name, Camille. There was no signature, just the name, and that was enough. On the night of the event, he arrived early. The venue was simple: children running, elderly people chatting, entire families gathered on plastic chairs. Everything he had avoided his entire life was now what welcomed him most. He sat in the back. The lights dimmed. On stage, she appeared, hair loose, dress light, a serene presence. There was no luxury. There was truth. She read a text she had written for her son, but which, unknowingly, pierced his heart like a knife. Absence teaches the value of what never returns, but it also teaches that true love doesn't need an audience, only courage to exist. He didn't cry, not in front of everyone, but inside something collapsed, because there was the woman he had deemed inferior, and who now taught him, silently, what it meant to be whole. When she stepped off the stage, her eyes met his, and she smiled, a brief smile of someone who forgives but never returns, and that was the beginning of the most silent punishment he could ever imagine, living each day, knowing he had her, and let her go. He never returned to the mansion after that night. He put the house up for sale, the penthouse downtown too. All the seemingly solid possessions began to crumble like castles made of expensive sand. And yet, he didn't try to hold on. For the first time, he felt that letting go was a just punishment, not for her, but for himself. He sold artwork, donated cars, and dismissed his security guards. It was as if he were dismantling, piece by piece, the armor he'd worn for years to hide what he'd never dared to be: human. He moved into a simple rental apartment. He bought bread at the bakery on the corner. He walked. No one recognized him on the streets anymore. And for the first time, that was good. Without the weight of his name, his surname, the invitations, the spotlight. He was finally just himself. And it was in this state of near anonymity that he began visiting the community center more often. Not to see her, she never spoke to him again, but to help with the activities. He helped stack boxes, carry donations, organize the lines of children coming to get snacks. No one there knew he'd once been in the headlines of business magazines, and that saved him. Every now and then, she'd see her son running around the yard, laughing with other boys. She never approached, but she also never left without seeing him. Only once did she get close enough to hear the boy say, pointing to a drawing on the wall, "This is my mother. She's strong, but sometimes her eyes get sad." He swallowed hard. He wanted to say he knew, that he remembered those eyes, but he said nothing. He simply walked away slowly, as if respecting a space that was no longer his. It was a Saturday afternoon that something changed. He was in the downtown bookstore when he found, on a nearly hidden shelf, a small, handmade book of local poetry. He flipped through it by chance and stopped at a page with a dedication in familiar script. For those who understand that love is not asked for in return, but lived only once. The author's name was at the bottom, Camille. He bought the book, took it home, and began reading each page as if deciphering his own judgment. And that was it. Each verse was a sentence, each phrase a memory. On the last page was an untitled poem, simple, direct, like her. It said, "Love has no address, but if you want to find it, you must first lose yourself." He closed the book with trembling hands, and he cried. For the first time, he cried not from loss, but from surrender, because he understood. Everything he had always tried to control, she had always let flow, and while he built empires to protect himself from the world, she built bridges to move forward. That night, he wrote his last letter, not to send, but to close. He wrote, If you ever feel that I can, even from afar, be part of your peace, I will be here, on the other side of the bridge you built, waiting in silence, because now I've learned not to speak when someone's heart is saying everything. The days passed like loose leaves in the wind. There was no longer any rush, no more alarm. Life now was made up of small gestures and long silences. He who once commanded entire rooms with a single word now chatted with children about how to tie a shoelace or open a package of cookies. The community center became his place of abiding, not for penance but for learning. He wasn't seeking redemption, he sought understanding, and more than anything, to accept that some stories are only written when we stop trying to control them. Camille didn't stop him from being there, but she didn't approach either. She maintained the same silent dignity as always, as if she understood that time takes its toll, but also teaches. And he respected her. He avoided forcing reunions. He learned to honor her space with the same reverence she had for him when she was still just the invisible woman in the big house. One day, while helping with a donation drive, he received an envelope with his name on it from a volunteer. There was no return address. Inside, only a photograph of the boy sitting on a wooden staircase drawing in his hands. In the background, a piece of paper taped to the wall read, "Family is where the heart rests." He recognized the handwriting. It was hers. That photograph became a personal altar. He placed it on the wall of the simple room where he now lived, and every morning he looked at it as if praying, as if silently confessing everything he once denied. The boy grew. With each event, he saw him a little taller, more relaxed, with the same gestures he himself made when playing with his hair, or distracted himself by watching the birds. And even though he had never called him father, there was a connection between them. Invisible, yes, but real and strong. One afternoon, when rain delayed an activity at the center, the two ended up alone in one of the classrooms. The boy was drawing in silence. He was organizing toys, until the boy, without looking up, asked, "Are you my mother's friend?" He sucked in a breath and answered honestly, "I was, and I still am, even though she doesn't talk to me." The boy thought for a moment and said, "She does, just in a different way, a way no one understands." It was like a spiritual touch, as if fate itself were using a child to say there's still time. But time isn't measured in clocks now, it's measured in courage. The following week, the center organized a special gathering. Each volunteer received a tribute written by the children. He wasn't expecting anything, but he received a blue envelope. Inside, a note signed by the boy. "Thank you for being the adult who doesn't say much but helps everyone." There was a drawing beside it. 3 figures holding hands, a woman, a gray-haired man, and a child with a ball. It was a family, the family he had destroyed, and which silently was beginning to be reborn in the pure features of someone who didn't yet know that forgiveness is the greatest act of justice. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table, the boy's note in his hands, the drawing beside him, and a cup of tea growing cold without being touched. The silence of the apartment was different from the silence of the mansion he had once lived in. Here, there was no marble. There were thin walls, the noise of neighbors, human sounds, but there was also something new, truth. And that was what hurt the most, because his entire previous life, with its contracts, titles, parties, and impeccable dinners, now seemed like poorly rehearsed theater compared to the simplicity of a children's cartoon with 3 people holding hands. He began to walk the streets more often, not as a man walking, but as one searching for signs. I noticed details I'd never noticed before. A lady who fed cats in silence, a young artist who painted walls as if praying with paint, an elderly couple who sat on the same park bench every day without needing to say a word. And he finally understood that the love he'd rejected wasn't unusual. It was just real, and the real for someone who's always lived by appearances is more frightening than any tragedy. It was on one of these walks that he entered a small neighborhood church. He wasn't religious, never had been, but something drew him there. He sat in the last pew. There was no mass, no ceremony, just the echo of the architecture and the smell of old wood. He closed his eyes. He made no wishes. He simply gave thanks for still being there, whole, after everything, for still having that chance even if she never returned. And then when he opened his eyes, he saw something that paralyzed him. Camille, standing near the altar, lighting a candle. He didn't see her, or maybe he did, but he pretended not to. And he respected her. He didn't approach, he simply watched. And in that silent scene, he understood that forgiveness doesn't require reunion. It requires humility. In the days that followed, he continued his routines at the community center. He never mentioned the church or the candle. But something in him had changed again. He began writing again, but not letters to her. He wrote to the boy, stories, short tales about men who make mistakes and try to make amends, about people who lose themselves in pride and find themselves again in truth. One of the stories ended with the phrase, "Sometimes love comes back with another name, and sometimes with the same voice, only softer." When the boy read one of these stories aloud in a reading circle, he looked at him at the end and said, "That's me, isn't it?" He laughed, tears in his eyes, and said, "Maybe it is, or maybe it is me." Camille listened from afar. She said nothing, but her eyes shone like they had that stormy night when they had first looked at each other without running away. On the way out, she passed him, her son at her side. She paused for a second. She looked into his eyes and said, in the same soft voice as before, "You're changing." He replied, his heart in his throat, "Because I saw you, and only those who truly see change." She didn't answer, but her son reached out and took hers, and in that gesture something invisible was forgiven, not as an apology, but as a beginning. After that day, their encounters began to happen with a naturalness that frightened more than it enchanted. They weren't reunions, they were new firsts, small conversations at the center's door, exchanges of books purposefully forgotten, glances that lingered longer than before, but still carried the care of someone who knows the pain of waiting too long. He never directly apologized. He knew that words don't mend absences. He also knew she didn't want explanations. What she wanted, and it took him years to understand, was constancy, presence without promises, truth without spectacle. The boy began to approach him more freely. He wanted to show him drawings, tell jokes, ask difficult questions. And he answered honestly. He never pretended to know everything. And precisely because of this, he became something to that child he never was to himself, someone trustworthy. One afternoon, while they were helping to put together a poster board mural, the boy said, "You look like the hero in the stories you write." He laughed. "Heroes make mistakes too." And the boy, with wisdom befitting his age, replied, "But they stay until the end." That sentence shattered him inside. Camille observed everything from afar, like someone testing the strength of a bridge before crossing it. She didn't rush. She didn't speed up anything. She knew that time heals, but it also takes its toll. And his every gesture was observed with the caution of someone who's been hurt by the suddenness of an uncontrolled feeling. When he invited her for coffee on a Saturday morning, she accepted, but with one condition: no souvenirs, only gifts. He nodded, and it was the lightest encounter they'd ever had. They laughed at silly things, they talked about old movies, they avoided names. And yet, there was more truth there than in all the nights at the mansion. The following week, the center held a special activity on gratitude. The children were asked to write letters to important people. The boy asked for help writing his. He chose difficult words. He drew stars and hands holding hearts. At the end, he wrote, "Thank you for not giving up on me, even though you didn't know I was yours from the start." And he handed the letter to him, with a hug that lasted a few seconds for someone who carries blood without knowing it. He couldn't read it at the time. He kept it in his pocket like someone holding something sacred. He only read it when he got home alone, and when he finished, he wrote underneath the letter, his hand trembling, "Now I know, and I'll never stop knowing." He placed the letter on the wall next to the photograph, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that sometimes fate gives back, not when we want it, but at the exact moment we're ready to receive it. The following Sunday, Camille showed up at his door. She didn't say anything. She just arrived. He opened the door. She said, "I didn't come to return. I came to see." He smiled. "Then come in, because everything here only makes sense when you see it." She walked in, and time, for the first time, didn't weigh her down. Camille's visit didn't happen again in the following days. She didn't call, she didn't text. He left no trace, and he didn't insist. He had finally understood that her time obeyed a different frequency. One more, faithful to truth than to expectation. He continued his routine at the community center, now with a more serene presence, not because he had won, but because finally he had given up fighting what had always been stronger, the truth that grows in silence. It was on a cloudy autumn afternoon that he received a call from the hospital. The assistant, in a gentle voice, said, "She asked you to come." He didn't ask why. He just went. When he arrived, he found Camille lying down, pale but alert-eyed. The boy was asleep in a chair nearby. She smiled when she saw him. "It's not serious, just tests, but I wanted you to come, not because I'm weak, but because you're strong." He sat beside her, held her hand, and in that touch, there was everything they had never been able to say. They talked for hours, about the boy, about books, about her childhood and the things no one knew. She told him she'd thought about reaching out to him years ago when she found out she was pregnant. But pride, hers and his, built walls too high. She also said she'd never hated him. "It just hurt me to think you heard I love you as a threat and not as shelter." He squeezed her hand tightly. "I was a coward. But today, I'm the shelter, if you want." She closed her eyes, as if keeping the phrase in her heart without promising an answer. Days later, she was discharged. She gradually returned to her routine. But something in her had changed. She was slower, more contemplative, as if she felt a cycle coming to an end. And it was. The boy, now almost 5, began calling him my dear friend to anyone who asked, and he accepted this as the greatest title he had ever held in life. One day Camille said, "When he grows up, I want him to know that his father changed his world, even if it was silent." And he replied, "His world changed mine first." One night as they walked home together after a little school performance, the boy stopped on the sidewalk, pointed to the sky and said, "Look, 3 stars. Together, they look like us." They looked, and indeed they were, side by side, small but shining. Camille held her son's hand with her left, and with her right she held his, and they walked like that, in silence, with the world outside spinning too fast, but their time finally falling into place. At the end of that year he wrote a children's book. He published it without his full name. He dedicated it to the boy who taught me to stay, and to the woman who asked me for nothing, but gave me everything. The book sold poorly, but a copy reached a journalist who remembered him as the tycoon who had disappeared. He wanted to write a story. He declined. He said, "My story is now mine alone, and hers." The journalist respected his words. Camille never asked him to move back in with them, but little by little he started waking up there, making coffee, picking him up from school, and one day, without fanfare, without promises, she put an extra toothbrush in the bathroom. He didn't comment, but he understood. Love had returned, not as unbridled passion, but as permanence, as justice in time. Years later, the boy grew up. He became a man. At his graduation, he gave a short speech. He said, "If I'm here today, it's because 2 people had the courage to relearn. One taught me how to see the world, the other, how to stay in it." He looked at the audience, smiled at them both, and added, "Not every father is born ready. But mine was born when he heard an 'I love you' and had to lose someone to learn how to listen." That night, when he got home, he walked into his room and saw a letter on his pillow, written by Camille. It simply said, "Now you hear me, and so you can keep me, because the love that doesn't go away is the one that ultimately stays." He closed his eyes, and he understood. Karma had been fulfilled, not as punishment, but as a path.